Now, originally I had no intentions of talking about or even playing through Persona 3 Reload's take on the answer. After I made that video on the main game, I figured I had my fill of the whole thing. It's safe to say that Reload didn't leave me with the best taste in my mouth, so when all was said and done, I uninstalled the game and didn't think twice about it. While I was already aware of the whole expansion pass deal that was going on and how Reload's version of the answer was locked behind it, truth be told guys, I originally didn't have any intentions of talking about this game anymore. I think I made it pretty clear where my stance was on the whole thing, and I didn't really think that episode Aigis was going to change that. However, much like the characters, I myself am stuck in a time loop, doomed to cover every version of this game until the end of time. Maybe it was because of Stockholm Syndrome or whatever, but that initial indifference I had towards this DLC eventually transformed into genuine curiosity. I mean, really think about it. How often do you see remakes of content that's generally not considered to be all that great? Nearly every remake in recent years is of a title that's already critically and financially successful. Resident Evil, Silent Hill, Crash Bandicoot, Final Fantasy, all of these and many more are games that are already well regarded. I can't exactly say the same thing about Persona 3 The Answer. A lot of the issues that people take with this piece of content aren't flaws that could be fixed without doing some drastic overhauls. I have to admit, the mere idea of seeing what direction Atlus would go with when remaking The Answer certainly got my attention. But what really sealed the deal for me was that Sega and Atlus themselves decided to provide me with a review code for the expansion pass just in time for the release of episode Aigis. Alright then, I guess there aren't any more excuses now, are there? Despite my experiences with the main game, I went into episode Aigis with an open mind. I'm not exactly the biggest fan of The Answer. While I don't hate it nearly as much as I used to, it certainly is a very flawed experience, one that I think could benefit from a second pass. In some ways, episode Aigis manages to accomplish this. However, in its totality, this piece of content still suffers from many of the same issues as the base game, and in some ways, it's actually worse here, believe it or not. But first, I'd like to tell you about today's sponsor, Plarium, and special thanks to Universal Studios Licensing. Raid Shadow Legends is one of the most popular mobile games out there, and for good reason. Not only to support cross-play and cross-saving between mobile and PC, it's also easy to learn and offers a lot of depth under the hood. One of my favorite aspects about Raid is its sense of community, as you can create a clan that your friends and family can join. Check it out, I even made one myself. It's called the Compendium, and you can find it by looking at my username nom12399. I'm still taking applicants, so get in while you can. And hey, check this out. Raid is currently partnering with Universal and Mattel to bring the iconic He-Man and Skeletor to the game as legendary champions. There's a 14-day loyalty program going on right now. If you sign in for at least 7 days, then you'll get Skeletor for free, with even more bonuses to keep you coming back. But keep in mind that this is only for a limited time and will end on January 8th. So make sure you start logging in by December 25th to snag Skeletor before he's gone. That's not all, because Raid is also doing a special Christmas event on their website, where you defend Santa with snowballs to potentially win gaming and smartphone devices and in-game loot. Keep in mind that you only have 24 hours after downloading Raid to be eligible to participate in this event, and also it ends on January 15th. So what are you waiting for? Download Raid Shadow Legends today using my QR code or link in the description. When you do, you'll unlock Vergis, one of the most powerful epic champions in the game, and when your account reaches level 25, you'll earn Rector Drath, an incredibly strong support unit. Also, you didn't hear this from me, but if you use promo code Monkey King, you'll get the legendary Sung Wukong right away, and I seriously wish I had all these guys when I started. Once again, major thanks to Plarium and Universal Studios Licensing for sponsoring today's video. It's worth acknowledging that when you buy the Persona 3 Reload expansion pass, you're getting a few extra goodies as well. Sure, episode Aigis is the main selling point, but during the lead up to release, owners of the expansion pass would periodically get some bonus costumes and music. It's nothing too special in all honesty, and exists mostly to justify the price. Kind of weird that there are costumes locked behind this though, considering Atlus was more than happy to sell every other outfit separately. The point is, if you're buying the expansion pass, you're doing so for episode Aigis. However, how much that price point is worth it to you hinges almost entirely on how much you like Reload's core systems. If you thought the main game's dungeon crawling was a slog and wanted to rush through it as fast as possible, then you might struggle to find much to enjoy here. It's mostly more of the same mechanically, but with a few new bells and whistles to help distinguish it from the base experience. On the bright side, this means that if you did enjoy Reload's direction, then you'll be right at home here. I say this because episode Aigis, both the original and the remake, is mostly a combat experience. Obviously, it has a story that it's trying to tell too, but it's only a fraction of the total playtime. Just like with the main game, episode Aigis' narrative is the exact same as the original game. Makoto dies, Abyss of Time, Yukari cries, and at the end of the day, the characters are able to overcome their grief and repair the bonds they once shared. It's not the most amazing story in the world, but it's got some good moments, and if you're a fan of these characters, then you're bound to at least find something that speaks to you. The issue is that all of this story content is sandwiched between hours upon hours of dungeon crawling, and due to how much emphasis is placed on that portion of the game, it's only natural that we start there first. In my original video on Persona 3 Reload, I was pretty vocal in my disappointment regarding the direction the game took with its combat. To me, it felt as though the elements that made Persona 3 unique in terms of gameplay were severely gutted or removed for the sole purpose of making it more like their most popular game, even if it comes at the cost of diminishing what made that original title work as well as it did. I mean, there's a lot more I took issue with, but you could just watch the video. The point is, I went into episode Aigis not expecting any fundamental changes, and yeah, that baseline was met. The core systems are just like the base game. Persona 5 combat with a few gimmicks that help keep the game feeling a bit more distinguished from a gameplay perspective. The only real difference is that Aigis has a couple of alternate fusion spells compared to Makoto. 3 to be exact. There's Justice, Dream Eater, and Shadow Hound. Unfortunately, just like the other fusion spells in Reload, they're more so focused on dealing damage above all else. Justice in particular went through a massive overhaul, and it's not nearly as interesting to me because of it. Again, fusion spells were a good mechanic in the original game, not just because you had to manage their limitations, but because most of them had rather unconventional abilities, with only a handful being used for straight damage. Now, all of them function the same, with the only real defining feature being that they scale in damage. With the exception of Shadow Hound, which is only really unique because it's single target, there was almost no point in changing the fusion spells between the base game and the answer. Trust me, I did try to take advantage of the secondary effects that come with these skills, but playing that way is extremely suboptimal, and trust me, I'll be sure to get into that one later. The Persona Compendium was added to the answer, which is a good thing, but it's not what I'd consider to be worthy of praise. It's cool that Atlas did listen to player feedback and adjust to the game in ways that make sense and don't disrupt the flow, but at the same time, I'm pretty sure we all expected these things to be included anyways. Adding a feature that shouldn't have been cut in the first place isn't going above and beyond, but it's worth acknowledging. What I wasn't expecting though were some of the smaller mechanics from the PS2 game making an appearance. One of the very first things I noticed about episode Aigis is that it brought back the randomized equipment that the original game had. In my video on base Reload, I expressed disappointment that this feature was gutted. Randomized weapon and armor effects is a great idea for RPGs, as it makes every piece of equipment found unique. Very rarely will two pieces of equipment be identical, thus making each playthrough personalized, and it gives you a reason to always explore. I was bummed out that Reload dropped this in favor for static gear. This, combined with the lack of multiple weapon types for the main character, made character progression feel rigid. While we're still stuck with one class of weapon in this DLC, there was, at the very least, an attempt to reintroduce this old feature. And the way it's handled is honestly pretty cool. Instead of monad passages, episode Aigis only has monad doors. However, unlike the base game, you're able to place bets against yourselves to get more rewards out of it. It's not done through stat modifiers either. Rather, each difficulty changes the amount of rounds you need to clear, with the hardest ones lasting up to 3 rounds. And since monad doors technically count as random encounters, any game overs here will send you back to the title screen. Manage to clear out all the rounds and you'll be rewarded with a fat stack of chests that contain rare items and some potentially great equipment. I actually think this is a fantastic idea that could potentially add a lot to the dungeon crawling. Unfortunately though, the execution leaves a lot to be desired. Firstly, the pool of mini-boss formations that can be found in the monad doors is seriously lacking. I'd say there's about 4 or 5 per Abyss of Time block, but if you're like me and always went for the high-risk ones, you're always going to see at least 3 of them. There were even multiple points where I've gotten the exact same enemy layout a few times in a row. When you manage to crack the boss formula once, once, then you can easily do it every other time. Hell, you'll even have access to the weakness data right off the bat, so at that point, it's really no different than a random encounter. But let's talk about that equipment real quick. I get the feeling that there either wasn't enough time for testing, or the designers overcompensated, but the type of equipment that you can get is quite frankly absurd. The randomized equipment effect scales exponentially as you traverse the abyss of time. It starts off being rather reasonable, like increasing some stats by a set amount, or providing a resistance of some kind. But at a certain point, it just flies off the deep end. Not even halfway through the DLC was I getting equipment that could increase one stat by nearly 10 digits, and by the end of the game, it was nearly 15 points on a single stat. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. You can get some disgustingly strong auto and passive skills if you're willing to work for it. Some of them are even on par with the base game's ultimate equipment. For example, Yukari's ultimate bow is supposed to give her auto concentrate, a very good skill for random encounters. Its status as an endgame weapon made sense. However, in episode Aigis, auto concentrate is a skill that can be rolled on any piece of equipment, meaning that you could give it to people that were not even intended to have it to begin with, and also obtain it way earlier than you should. I found a chest plate for Aigis that came with auto concentrate, and I never changed my armor after that. Managed to find an auto charge weapon for Metis, and congrats, you just beat the game. The moment you decide to tackle the monad doors is when the snowball starts tumbling down the hill. That's a bit of a paradox, isn't it? These doors and passages are meant to exist to test your skills and provide a challenge, but they actually do the opposite. It only becomes easier to clear these doors out as you progress, because the scaling of the equipment is far too extreme. It's borderline impossible to appreciate the design of these fights when you have to go out of your way to nerf yourself just to get any semblance of challenge. It's clear that the bosses in episode Aigis, both the monad doors and the main ones, are following a similar design philosophy to the answer on PS2. The different formations are constructed in ways that are meant to complement each other. These should be fun puzzle fights, and they would be if Reload didn't encourage and reward this stupid style of play where DPS matters above all else. In game design, players tend to gravitate towards strategies that require the least amount of effort for the maximum reward. This is why theurgy spam is such a big problem. They're safe moves that deal crazy amounts of damage, pierce resistances, and cost nothing. The only amount of strategies with these is using them when you're buffed or after charging. There's no reason to not use a theurgy when it's time to deal damage, because time spent holding onto one could have gone towards charging up your next theurgy. It's even worse with Aigis because of how easy it is to build a persona that specializes in dealing certain types of damage. Combine all of this with episode Aigis' new equipment rule, and you can probably see the issue. Players don't need to interact with boss gimmicks anymore because the damage race is all that matters at the end of the day. Why should I bother to experiment with certain party formations or strategies when I know that it's less efficient than just slinging my nukes at it? It's funny because this is the exact opposite problem with the answer on PS2. That game had some frustrating segments because certain formations would contain enemies that had dodge and evade passives to help cover their weaknesses. It came off as a bit of a haphazard way to justify the use of agility buffs rather than being an interesting challenge on its own. I'm more willing to put up with that in the case of the PS2 game because at the very least, the alternate strategies on offer didn't trivialize the game. You could go against the grain and not strike weaknesses at all if you don't think the potential risk of missing is worth it. Hell, sometimes it's a good idea to alter your composition specifically for that fight to help give yourself a better chance of victory. Say what you want about the answer, but at the very least it does a good job at justifying the use of certain characters better than the journey did. Characters that I otherwise wouldn't use end up becoming pivotal chips to my strategy because of something as simple as having access to one or two skills, or an affinity that would benefit me in having. The key differences between these two games is that one of them actively forces you to earn your victory, while the other one is more than happy to let you take shortcuts that completely bypass the challenge. I don't know if this is a hot take or not, but episode Aigis is somehow easier than the base game is. On top of the random equipment being fucking ridiculous, player progression is accelerated at such a fast rate that you'll quickly gain access to some disgustingly good abilities. The assault mode is back, and you get it way earlier than before. Say goodbye to enemy advantages. Critical hits are just as, if not more exploitable than before thanks to the Justice Theurgy. You're able to do this even earlier than previously. I spent the whole game just basically using the same strategy over and over, only changing when I literally couldn't deal damage. Why are there enemies weak to physical in a game where physical skills are just the best best option to deal damage. It's not even a one-off thing either. Because nearly every enemy would go down in the same 1-2 punch combo, I wasn't encouraged to experiment. In fact, I was rewarded for sticking to the same strategy because skill cards are everywhere, so it takes no effort to fine-tune a persona to perfection. And that's not even considering what the party members are able to do with their busted-ass personality traits. Metis is by far the best party member in the game. She was already a really solid unit in the original game, but I guess Atlas wanted to make absolutely sure that the player used her because Jesus Christ. She has insane coverage, her physical attacks deal crazy damage, especially if you take time to give her good equipment, but it's in her personality trait where Metis' true utility lies. The gimmick with Metis is that by shifting to her from Aigis, not only do you fill her theurgy by 1/3, she also gains up to a 40% damage increase. So if you charge with Metis, then land a critical hit with Aigis, congrats, you just won the fight. It's especially true with a full theurgy gauge. I had to bench Metis for most of my playthrough because she really is just that fucking strong. If you have a good persona on Aigis and an optimized Metis on your team, which isn't hard to do, then you just won the game. I managed to beat the Shadow of Doubt before he could even copy any of the other party members' personas, and poor Junpei over here never even stood a chance.
Doing great, my What should I do? I can use it now.
No, not like this.
Let me just remind everyone that this is on the hardest difficulty, by the way. Whenever I talk about difficulty in these games, it isn't just because I'm trying to gatekeep or be an elitist. It's because challenge is important to game design. Brute force should almost never be the answer, especially in a game that's built around strategy, customization, and execution. I don't mind lower than average difficulty as long as the game encourages the use of its core systems. I don't find a game like Final Fantasy X to be all that hard, but its game design encourages the use of all of the game's systems. You're constantly in the action, always thinking about your next move and how you're going to manipulate the turn and party order to your advantage. You become accustomed to the kits that your party has access to, and every fight is built around that knowledge. It's hard to think of any boring boss fights in 10 because of the multiple ways you can approach each fight and how the outcome of the fight could change in an instant if you weren't ready. Do I wish Final Fantasy X was more challenging? Yeah, a bit, but I'm not going to sit here and discredit all of the great game design that game has to offer because of a preference. Persona 3 Reload is easy because its design isn't all that solid when you look at it with a fine lens. Whether that be because of time constraints or a genuine damage formula problem, ultimately, the game is still way too easy even on the hardest difficulty setting. I don't want these games to be beating my ass in 100% of the time, but I do want some resistance, even on normal mode. The original version of the answer didn't even have a difficulty selection, you were just locked on the default one. A common misconception with the PS2 version of the answer is that the game is locked to hard mode. People tend to say this because the answer is inherently more challenging than the journey. Even I used to be guilty of saying this. However, it's simply just not true. None of the damage, experience, or ambush modifiers that the journey's hard mode uses are applied in the answer. The only reason why the answer is more challenging is because of the design. It can be frustrating when you have to do the same trial and error for every boss, and I really don't like the lack of teleporters, but I find the gameplay experience of the answer to be far more engaging because it at least asks you to play the game. I honestly find the increase in challenge to be appropriate, both design-wise and thematically. At the end of the day, episode Aigis is an expansion, so it's safe to assume that the player base should already be accustomed to how this game is meant to be played. Why bother wasting time forcing people to work their way back up from the bottom when we can instead start them off with all the utility of the tactics unlocked and a healthy selection of party members? There was a legitimate choice to make at the very start of the answer, and the game only opens up more and more as you descend further down the abyss. The increased challenge can also make the player miss their original character. Makoto was essentially a one-man army, and there was a high chance he had some pretty good personas at the end of the journey, so starting the answer with nothing but the skin on your back and a level 20 Orpheus, you'll immediately start missing your old stuff. I know there were a few times when I first played this expansion and thought, man, if only I had Makoto. Even if I didn't miss him in the story, I was missing him in the gameplay, and that's what matters. It's hard to feel that way when playing Reload because Aigis is literally the exact same as Makoto mechanically. In fact, I would argue that she's a bit better now because of her theurgies. Makoto dying was an upgrade for the player. It's hard to miss the main character when you essentially have a perfect copy of them running around. Did you know that growth skills stack in this game? Yeah, if you put growths 1, 2, and 3 on a persona, then it can effectively gain almost double the experience. So in a game all about fighting enemies and growing stronger because of it, the fastest, most efficient way to become stronger is to not use the guy you're trying to train.
I don't even understand how that works.
Because episode Aigis is mostly gameplay and it's now painfully easy, I found myself getting rather bored pretty quickly, and I already thought the original game dragged its feet for too long. 25 hours, and it's just as long here. This is one of those lose-lose situations. Either you make structural changes and rewrites to improve the game, but it comes at the cost of going against the faithful remake directive, or you keep things the same and you have people complain that it should have been fixed. It's a slippery slope, and it's impossible to make every type of fan happy. Considering Reload's mission statement was to be as loyal to the original game as possible, I can at the very least compliment the commitment to stick to that pacing. However, I will say that this remake isn't exactly consistent with what it considers to be a necessary change, and not all of these changes end up resulting in a better product, and it's the most noticeable with this version of the Answer's story. I read an interview a while back with the game's producer, talking about some of the issues that the original version of the Answer had. According to Wada, the PS2 game had some issues when it came to properly conveying the different perspectives and opinions of the characters. Since the party drama was at the core of the story, having that information correctly shown to players is very fucking important to get right. I already thought that the base Reload experience struggled with this a bit. Sure, the general ideas of the original cutscenes were conveyed, but it was done in a far less interesting and effective way than before. It was especially egregious with the game's 2D animated cutscenes. To be expected, episode Aigis suffers from the same issue. If it was the developers' intentions to fix this communication issue, then I'm sorry, but it backfired hard. In fact, I'm gonna argue that every single change made to this game's version of the story makes it worse. That is a very bold claim to make, but hear me out for a second. Persona 3's episode Aigis is trying to tell a story about the different ways people deal with grief. In Persona 3's case, the character's first instincts is to turtle up into their shells once again, with only a few exceptions. Because of this, the relationship begins to crumble and the tensions rise. This feeling of disconnect is integral for the story to work in any capacity. At a glance, episode Aigis seems to handle that well enough. But then, the new content is introduced, and it's among some of the most out-of-place shit I've experienced in these games. Brought over from the base game are the dorm activities. Mechanically, they're the same as before, only altered a tad to fit with a different structure. So, why are these here exactly? In case you need a reminder, the reason why dorm hangouts exist at all in Reload is because people found the distant nature of C's to be a bit off-putting. I personally never had an issue with this, but these new events were ultimately harmless at worst. Dorm activities were additive and fit well within the context of the game's narrative. The exact opposite is true for episode Aigis. Not only does the inclusion feel rather haphazard, but they do more to harm the narrative than anything. We've gone from C's not feeling like friends to them being some of the most buddy-buddy group you can find in RPGs. For a game all about disconnection, it's even the main theme song, why are the characters so friendly towards each other here? All this does is make the writing feel more inconsistent than it actually is. You'll go from scenes of quiet, personal reflection to just casually shooting the shit immediately after. It's jarring and doesn't work well at all with the game's story. Also, the context behind these events are just plain stupid. Watch some classic films, maybe cook a delicious meal, or perhaps spend the afternoon doing homework you found after beating a boss. Like, are we being serious here? Is now really the best time to be taking it easy? Whose homework is this anyways? School is out of session, guys. The reason why this is such a big issue is because the entire third act of the story hinges on the party's poor communication. When you include cutscenes, optional or otherwise, that demonstrate the exact opposite message, then your story lacks consistency. I have a hard time believing at all that this version of C's would end up fighting each other. They're also respectful and kind towards each other that I can believe they can find a way to peacefully hash things out. I don't know how they did it, but they somehow made the C's conflict make even less sense than the originals. At the very least there, you could argue that emotions got the better of the group, so rational thinking could get thrown out there. In Reload, this cutscene is nothing more than a civil disagreement. If the escalation was abrupt before, it's completely out of nowhere here. And don't even get me started on the whole translation argument either. Regardless of the intent of the original Japanese script, it's still Alice's job to make sure that is translated over into English. If the translation's bad, then it's still an issue. But here's the thing, this argument still holds little water. Some of the more famous meme lines that were only in the English script made it into this remake.
More like stupid, ace defective.
I've been waiting for this!
Translation accuracy was probably not on their minds if Atlas was willing to cherry pick lines like this. And secondly, Japanese players are complaining about this stuff too, so if your entire argument is built around this, you might want to reconsider your position. Another perplexing narrative choice is what the writers ended up doing with Metis. In the original game, there wasn't a whole lot to her. She's meant to be a reflection of Aigis' obsession over the protagonist, a literal reflection of who Aigis used to be versus who she is now. It's meant to serve as a way to demonstrate her character growth and how the members of C's helped her find her purpose in life. But aside from her role as a narrative device, there's not much else to Metis. If faux social elements were going to be added to episode Aigis, then it should have been used to help flesh out Metis more as an individual. What's weird is that the game almost tricks you into thinking we're going to get just that. Very early on, we see a brand new event where Metis and Aigis hang out at the mall. It naturally builds off of a character quirk that appeared in the main story, and ends with the unspoken promise of more to come. But this is the only time when this happens, and I didn't believe it at first. No joke, I remember asking my friends when more of these were going to happen, and being blown away when I found out that this scene right here is all that we're getting. That is so lame! There are new cutscenes with Metis during the Hangout event, but they play up the sister complex so much that even you Narukami would tell you to chill out. There's nothing interesting done with Metis, and that's such a huge missed opportunity. If we're gonna be adding content anyways, why not have it center around the new character that's exclusive to the DLC? Imagine how much it would improve the game if Metis and Aigis built a legitimate relationship. It would make the Colosseum battle drama more effective, since we would be able to relate to Aigis' feeling of betrayal way more. I don't know, maybe there was some mandate in place or the budget wasn't as large as it should have been. And honestly, even now, it's not hard to notice. The cutscenes in Persona 3 Reload are a major point of contention with people. This is one of those things I took issue with the most. While you are getting the general gist with Reload's cutscenes, they pale in comparison to the originals in almost every way. The cinematography, blocking, color choice, and even general direction was a bit lacking in the remake. However, despite all of that, the cutscenes were close enough to the original that new players are still getting most of the intended emotions. I can't say the same thing in regards to episode Aigis. Of course, there are still your standard Reload trappings that you either like or dislike, but now we have to deal with the game's lack of budget rearing its ugly head. The 2D animated cutscenes in episode Aigis aren't very good. The pacing is rushed, the direction is flat and uninteresting, and in a worst case scenario, fails to communicate vital information. There are 3 cutscenes in particular that come to mind when I think of this. There's the very first prologue scene, the Shadow of Doubt defeat, and the Great Seal scene. All 3 of these cutscenes suffers from at least one of these issues. The opening scene has a lot less impactful animation, making the entire fight sequence feel stiff and awkward. The Shadow of Doubt cutscene was completely changed, and now conveys a very different tone. The original game had this chilling sequence where the Shadow Makoto vanished layer by layer. A little edgy and on the nose, sure, but it was an effective and chilling way to really hammer in that the main character was gone. I like how this scene ends with this brief flash of Makoto smiling. It's as if he's finally at peace because C's was able to confront and move on from their regrets. The icing on top is that the game lets the players stew on the moments by not telling them how they're supposed to feel. It's a weird, uncomfortable, almost shocking cutscene that might come out of nowhere, but it's by design. In Reload, this scene has been altered rather significantly. Not only was the graphic imagery toned down, but reaction shots of the characters looking somber was added. There's even this really cheesy part where Aigis reaches out to the main character before he vanishes. That's probably one of the most cliche and generic changes you could have made, and it robs people the opportunity of drawing their own conclusions. Now the game is just flat out telling you how you're supposed to feel, and it makes it worse as a result. The Great Seal cutscene stands out because it's so obviously shortened and trimmed down to only show the bare minimum. Hell, the music isn't even synced up anymore. It cuts off way too early. Like, what was the direction on this one specifically? Because this doesn't feel right. The problem we run into when trying to talk about something like this is that we don't know the full details behind this project's management. Sure, I can sit here all day and make critiques and give feedback, but I don't have the full picture here. If something like shot composition or animation quality isn't the highest, it's hard to make a definitive statement as to why that is. It could be a lack of time, underfunding, poor communication between teams, or even as something as simple as bad direction. The point is, there's too many different factors at play here to give many ways to improve what we have. While I can empathize with that potential frustration, there's only so many excuses I can give. At a certain point, you just have to accept things the way they are and go from there. And unfortunately, for episode Aigis, we reach diminishing returns if you catch my drift. Alright, that's it. I've talked about everything to do with this game, or at the very least, everything that I wanted to cover. I mean, I could keep going if I wanted to. I never did talk about Shuffle Time, but I think I'll leave that for someone else. It really sucks when something that you're looking forward to doesn't live up to those expectations. I look back to when this remake was first announced and see just how excited I was, but as more and more of Reload was shown off, that optimism was slowly eroded away. Despite noticing a bunch of red flags, I was willing to give this game a shot and see if it could still win me over. It's pretty obvious how that turned out. Though what's disappointing about this whole scenario to me isn't so much that the game itself wasn't to my liking, rather it's been the fan reaction surrounding it. While not as bad as some of the most infamous examples, Persona 3 Reload has brought out the worst within this community, arguably more than any other Mega 10 game has. I'm not referring to one specific side either. Whether you're a die-hard Reload fan or someone who thinks the game is the worst thing Atlus ever put out, I think we can all agree that the discussions surrounding this game have gone completely off the rails. At this point in time, most people who are talking about Reload in any vocal capacity aren't doing so for the sake of discussion. Rather, they're treating it as an argument to be won, which is very antithetical to art. It's not enough that you like or dislike the game. One side is clearly in the wrong, and the other is more than happy to let you know why. Talking about this game isn't very fun anymore, because you just know that the moment you mention Reload, one of two things are gonna happen. If you like it, you'll have a bunch of dickheads calling you a slop consumer or some other meaningless garbage. And if you didn't like it, oh boy, you just committed a sin, pal. There's a very vocal group of Reload diehards that aren't just satisfied with their own enjoyment of the game. Rather, everyone else has to like it just as much as they do, and if they don't, then it has to be because they're nostalgia blind, or a grifter, or an attention seeker. It's not enough to just disagree with people. There needs to be this extra layer of invalidation on top of that to really hammer it in. Here's a fun game. Pull up a Persona 3 Reload review, whether that be positive or negative, where the author says something in favor of the original game's gameplay, and see how long it takes for you to find comments that attempt to dismiss any points as nitpicks. I don't give a shit if you don't care or don't think any of these points are a big deal, because this stuff matters to me. Like, when did we get so comfortable with curating the status quo of these games? How many times have you heard someone say this phrase? You can shit on and criticize these older games as much as you want, but don't you dare apply that same level of scrutiny to this remake. You're supposed to like this one. This is the objectively best version of the game. If you like these other versions, then you're just nostalgia blind. It gets so frustrating when people want to have a legitimate discussion about this game, only to be bombarded with hostility if you have the wrong opinion. Isn't one of the major themes in this game is how expressing different perspectives is the key to growth? Don't get me wrong, there are bad apples on both sides of this debate. It's just that one is certainly more vocal than the other. At least from my experience anyway. Again, this stuff exists in all types of fandom. I'm not pretending this is the first case of this. It's just something of an uptick I've noticed growing rapidly in recent times, and I don't see it stopping anytime soon. It's funny that for a remake that fans were clamoring for because they wanted a definitive experience, Reload doesn't really provide that at all. In fact, it does more to drive a wedge within the player base more than anything. It's just one more game to add to the pile that is the Persona 3 experience. It's a shame too, because while I never thought Persona 3 needed a remake, it was still an opportunity to potentially make the best version of the game. In a perfect world, we would have gotten everything Persona 3 related and even more new content on top of that. refine some of those old gameplay elements so that they can reach the potential that they always had. But we didn't get that, and there's not much we can do about it. As unfortunate as it may seem, the legacy of Persona 3 Reload won't be defined by its accomplishments. Rather, it's gonna be remembered for what it didn't do, and that is not something that you want to be stuck with. Hey everyone, thanks for watching. I'd like to give a special shout out to all of my channel supporters whose names are on screen now. If you want to join the ranks of these awesome people, then maybe consider joining my Patreon or becoming a channel member. The main perk is that you'll get videos like this and many more, usually 2 days in advance, among some other goodies too. If that sounds interesting to you, then consider following the links in the description to get started. Alright, I think I finally got out of my system. I really don't mean to be such a Grinch about this whole reload scenario, but the thing is, no matter the game, I always try my best to be honest and open about my thoughts. Persona 3 is one of my favorite games, so it just sucks to see a version of it that gets rid of all the stuff that made me like it in the first place. But like, at this point, I'm just sort of over it. I've come to accept that reload just isn't for me, no matter how much I want it to be. On the bright side though, Metaphor is pretty good. I've been enjoying it a lot, and I seriously can't wait to make a video on it. And hey, if you want to stay up to date with that and other upcoming projects, feel free to follow my Twitter and Blue Sky accounts. Both are linked in the description. As always, thank you all so much for watching, and I hope to see you all next time.